And we'll just start with some introductions. Professor DiVincenzi is a professor at San Jose State, and he has been involved with the climate issues for some time. He basically studied with Al Gore and took some of Al Gore's training. And he's now a public speaker on the climate issues. And he works a lot. He's worked with many different groups here in Santa Clara County. He has a long background in climate issues. So Tim, you want to start? Introduce yourself.
I'm just been recently familiar with the university up there and interested in this whole climate control. And I'm I'm new here and I'm here to listen and learn, to see how I can participate in the future.
You're down in Palm Springs, Tim?
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about your background.
I've been self-employed. I'm currently in the health insurance and Medicare insurance business.
Okay.
And I've worked for myself for over 30 years.
Okay. What about you, Carmen? How did you learn about us?
No, I'm not sure how I learned about you. I've been doing a lot of stuff with Michael Fox. Maybe that's where.
Matthew Fox.
Matthew Fox.
Yeah.
And I'm also on the Climate Reality Project group. I also went through that training with Al Gore. And I am retired. I was a lawyer, and before that I was a social worker. I've been a climate activist for a while. And I did see one presentation on what Pope Francis had said about the environment, and I'm just really excited about that because I think activists and spirituality seem to be so separate, and as Matthew Fox helps us to see that, it'd be great if activists could be inspired as well by their own spirituality and connect with that strength.
So thank you, Carmen. We have a course, actually a whole course on the Laudato Si, which is starting June the 8th. And my wife is the chairperson of the climate environmental issues called Stewards of Our Common Home for the Diocese of San Jose. So she works with the Catholic Church groups that are interested in climate issues and Pope Francis. So we have a whole course on that encyclical and on the outcome of that over the last, this is the 5th anniversary of that encyclical coming up in May.
5 already. Wow.
It's already 5 years since it was published. So we have this event. We have a whole certificate program we're offering on creation, spirituality, and environmental justice. And so this course on Laudato Si is the first in a series of courses we're offering, tying in with the spirituality and the climate issues, which often are not connected. So that's what we're trying to do. And that's kind of what GMU, in terms of religion and science, we do a lot in that area.
My background is 28 years in financial management, retired 25 years teaching at San Jose State University in the field of finance and accounting, and then retired, found out I wasn't good at retiring, and so decided to do a lot of soul searching, a lot of praying, trying to figure out, well, what is it that I want to do with the rest of my life? And the subject that popped out at me loud and clear was the climate crisis. And so I decided that I would devote the rest of my life to working on the climate crisis, because I'm concerned about the kind of world we're going to be leaving our children, our grandchildren, and all future generations. And so that's been my motivation from the beginning to get involved in this. So I went to training in Southern California in 2018 with Al Gore and the Climate Reality Project. I am now, along with my compatriot Aaron Zimmerman, in charge of the Speakers Bureau here in Silicon Valley for Climate Reality, and I've done relatively dozens of these talks, mostly without a hitch.
My wife and I were talking last night. The recent issue of The Economist has a major article on climate issues and carbon, and they were talking about whether technology can really be a solution, for the future. So I don't know, Bill, if you're going to go into that at all, but
yes.
Welcome, Mary Ann, and welcome, Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so let me get started and let's move down. You've already heard my spiel about who I am, so I'm going to just move on into the talk. Just some quick ground rules as we get started here. This is bipartisan. I have no political party affiliation. To me, it's always been a moral and humanitarian issue, but unfortunately, it's gotten political as well. I've used the scientific method. I've vetted my sources. I've done my own research as well as taking in the resources from the Climate Reality Project. So I'm very comfortable that what I'm proposing or presenting to you here is scientific fact. My purpose, as I mentioned earlier, is I'm really concerned about the future. This is why I got into this, that I'm leaving for my children and my grandchildren, all future generations and all life on this planet. The topic is broken down into 3 parts, starting with must we change? And if the answer to that is yes, can we change? And if the answer to that is yes, the big question is, will we? So first of all, the first question really is climate change real? I mean, there's a lot of deniers out there, and if it's real, is it a problem? So I'm going to address that right off. I start with the biggest picture. This is Apollo 17. These guys are heading towards the moon. They turn around, they look back, and they see this incredible sight. I mean, this beautiful blue ball floating in space, and everything, all life, everything we know, love, and adore, and cherish is there on that place. And it is our place in the universe. I'm going to refer you to that little kind of blue, you can see around the edges there. This is our atmosphere. It's about 5 miles thick. And when you consider that it's surrounding a ball that's 25,000 miles in circumference, it's like it's very thin, right? It is razor thin. So how global warming works is the sun sends down 3 types of light rays. You have visible light, which is great, you know, allows us to see during the day. The ultraviolet light, which burns you if you stay out on it too long. And infrared, which is what provides us with the heat. And so that heat comes down, those infrared rays come down, warm the earth, and in the process, some of that is reflected by the ocean and other areas of land back into space. So we're not getting the full effect of the sun, which is a good thing. Now the atmosphere does trap some of that reflected heat and keeps it within the Earth's atmosphere. And that's a good thing, because what that has allowed the planet to do is have a relatively consistent weather pattern, okay? Now, here's the problem. We're spewing 152 million tons of pollution into the atmosphere every day. And so what that has done is it has thickened that layer of atmosphere, and now you're seeing more and more of that infrared being trapped. So this is why they're calling this greenhouse gases, because that's the effect it's having. The thicker the atmosphere, the warmer the planet gets. Hence, what we call global warming. So that's my Global Warming 101 lecture for the day. When we look at global warming, we look at climate change, those terms seem to be used interchangeably. And what I want to point out is global warming is the cause, okay? Climate change is the effect of global warming. Climate change could be hotter or colder, okay? But the root cause is global warming. So the largest source of global warming is the burning of fossil fuels. Now you'll notice a lot of these slides I'm showing you start right at the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And so it's really pointing out to you man's contribution to the CO2 in the atmosphere. And you can see that it really took off right after World War II and is continuing to grow. Where's it coming from? All of these sources: landfills, transportation, oil production, industrial agriculture, coal plants, coal mining, crop burning. All of these things are putting CO2 and greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere. The thawing permafrost is a big worry, because that's putting up methane, which is a lot worse than CO2. So how does this affect our climate? Well, if you look at the last 800,000 years, and I just chose this because this is kind of how, when we as humans evolved, and all the plants and animals with us. And you can see that over that period of time, the parts per million of CO2 it ranges between 200 and 300 parts per million until you get to the current century, all right? And around the advent of the Industrial Revolution, you'd suddenly see that parts per million of CO2 just skyrocket. In 2019, that number has increased to 415 parts per million. Okay, so you say, so what? Well, let's look at this chart. Shows you that in blue now, the same CO2, but the red right below it is the temperature of the Earth. Now, this is from NASA, so this data is accurate. What you're seeing is an incredible correlation, right, between these two charts. It's unbelievable. The only difference is there's a slight time variation. Thank God. There is a slight time variation between the spike in CO2 and the spike in the global temperatures. So here we are sitting at a precarious point in time when the temperatures had not responded yet to that spike in CO2. But let me tell you, if it did, we would not be here right now. So this is the challenge we have in front of us. We need to get that spike back down to a normal level that would be beneficial for life on this planet. To prove the point, 19 of the 20th hottest years on record have occurred since 2001. Now, when I say on record, since the late 1800s, okay? And in fact, the hottest years of all have been the last 5 years. So it is warming up. No one can deny that. Global ocean temperatures have also been on the rise in recent years. And the impact of this has a significant impact on our global weather patterns. And if we take, for example, hurricanes, and we look at the fact that warmer oceans lead to more intense hurricanes, they intense much more rapidly because cold water tends to short circuit a hurricane, slows it down. With warmer water, it doesn't. And that hurricane will just go slam right into the coast without anything slowing it down. Also, because of the warmer water, you have more evaporation and there's more moisture in that hurricane. You notice 1 degree Celsius equals 7% more water vapor. That comes into play in the next slide. We also have surge increases due to sea level rise. And because of the jet stream issues, and I'll talk about that later, these storms tend to stay in place longer, okay? So looking at Hurricane Harvey as an example, Hurricane Harvey crossed the Gulf of Mexico in waters that were 4 degrees Celsius higher. Now remember, 7% more precipitation times 4 means there was 28% more moisture in that hurricane, and nothing to slow it down. That Category 5 earthquake slammed into Houston and Louisiana and dumped 50 inches of rain in 5 days on those two states. This is Houston, Texas, and they, were inundated with, a lot of damage and some lives lost. So this is what happens when so to put things in perspective, in our area, we get 10 to 12 inches of rain a year. They're getting 10 to 12 inches a day for 5 straight days. That's a lot of rain. But that's what's happening. Hurricanes are becoming bigger and stronger and more intense. Hotter years also have an impact on the number of major large fires. As you can see, again, the correlation between the temperature and the number of large fires. We don't have to be reminded of the Camp Fire a year ago that left 86 people dead in Paradise, California, and on $16.5 billion in losses. That was the worst of them all. But, interestingly enough, the 3 most expensive wildfires in world history, okay, have happened in the last 2 years, and all of them here in California, unfortunately. The Camp Fire that destroyed Paradise, the Tub Fire, when you're seeing on the picture there, destroyed parts of Santa Rosa, and the Woolsey Fire in Southern California being the worst. But we're not alone. Extreme weather catastrophes are happening all around the globe, and you can see a constant increase over the last 40 years in all of these extreme weather catastrophes. Now, the question is, how can global warming cause extreme cold? All right, in February of 2018, the temperature at the North Pole was 50 degrees Fahrenheit higher than normal, 50 degrees higher than normal. And you say, whoa, how did that happen? Well, there was some extremely hot weather in Asia that kind of moved north into the North Pole area. What it did was it disrupted the polar vortex. Now, you've probably seen that. In fact, we're having a polar vortex issue right now on the East Coast. But polar vortex is basically real cold air that kind of circles around the North Pole. And when it behaves itself, it stays there, okay? But this extreme hot weather pushed up and disrupted that vortex. And so here is a visual of what was happening. You see the polar vortex behaving itself, and then all of a sudden, this warm air from Asia comes up, warms up the North Pole, and sends extremely cold air down into the northeastern part of the United States and into Europe, with record temperatures, low temperatures resulting. The impact of that split in Chicago, the boardwalk on Lake Michigan totally froze over, including the lakefront. The temperatures dropped to a minus 22 degrees, minus 50 wind chill. I have a niece who lives just outside of Chicago, and she was telling me they couldn't go outside for 3 days because it hurt their lungs to breathe. Now that's bad, okay? That is just bad. Then in Northern Europe, in England, Trafalgar Square, the fountain there was frozen over. They had snow and ice around the Colosseum in Rome. I mean, these are not normal weather patterns, but that's how you get extreme cold. Another way to look at it is that the warming doesn't get rid of the cold snaps. It just makes them fewer, okay? And sometimes less duration when you're not having the polar vortex issue come into play. So it doesn't say that we will never have cold again. We will. It's just that we will have fewer incidents of it. Sea level rise. Okay, here's another one that result from global warming. And you see in this, there's 10 cities listed, Miami and New York being amongst the top 3 in terms of what assets are at risk by 2070, which is only 50 years from now. And again, we're talking, grandchildren here who are going to experience this, which is a problem for me. How about the Bay Area? If temperatures increase by 2 degrees Celsius from basically the 1880s, and right now we're up about 1%, this could cause a 20-foot rise in sea level, which would put Oakland and San Francisco airports underwater and a huge area around the bay as well. So, and where will all these people go? Obviously, we're going to have a migration problem. Food. Because of the warmer temperatures, there's more droughts. You see lower yields and less nutrition because that heat is baking out a lot of the nutrition in our food. You see more toxins as well. Notice it is all interconnected and interrelated. As far as health, we have similar kind of issues because of lower food, less water. You see much more air pollution, more allergens in the air affecting people's breathing, more infectious diseases, which we're experiencing right now, and a lot more extreme weather events. So all of these are adversely affecting health. I think this slide is staggering, that worldwide air pollution kills 9 million people every year. And you say, well, gee, why haven't we heard about this? Well, because it doesn't happen around here, but it's happening in third world countries. It's happening in China. It's happening in India. But this is a staggering figure when you look at that. We are also experiencing species extinction. Right now, it's possible that we could lose 50% of all land-based species in this century. Scientists are saying this is the largest mass extinction since the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. So, because these little guys can't adapt. We can, put on our air conditioners or whatever, take off our sweaters. These guys can't, and so they die. Another thought about the cost of carbon is not just the cost of extracting coal and oil from the ground. The economic cost of carbon is almost incalculable because it would involve putting a value on wildfires, drought, storm damage, climate refugees, species extinction, infectious diseases, sea level rise. All of those are part of the economic cost of carbon. And according to the World Economic Forum, this is the #1 threat to the global economy. So scientific studies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report in October of 2018. Now these guys do this every 6 years. This is in 6,000 scientific papers. This is big stuff. And so this time they compared the impact of a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. They're referring back again to the end of or the beginning of the Industrial Revolution versus a 2.0 degree. And right now we're currently at about a 1.0 degrees Celsius increase. So they're saying if it goes to 1.5, it's going to be bad. And if it gets to 2.0, it's going to be terrible. And so what we need to do is take some action immediately. And I'll talk about this more in a minute. Everything I've described so far in the slides, all those adverse impacts are due to a 1 degree Celsius, slightly less actually, than a 1 degree Celsius increase. So when we talk about the implications of a 1.5 degree or 2 degree, that impact is going to be significantly worse on our weather patterns, for sure. They also found out, much to their dismay, that this is all going to happen starting in 2030. And that's only 10 years from now, folks. So we're going to be able to see this. So we really can't let the government drag their feet any longer on this. We all need to take action. Speaking of the US, we also did our own national climate assessment in November. 1 month later came out in 2018. And this study acknowledged that global warming is real and that human activity is a dominant driver. And you say, wow, now that's a huge departure from what the administration's position is in terms of denying that climate change is a problem. And you say, well, why didn't I hear about this? Well, because it was released on Black Friday. Why do you think they released that report on that day? Obviously, nobody is paying attention to anything but ads at that point. So, you know, we need to make it happen. The last slide I want to leave you with is this one. We've been talking about these very minute changes, you know, 1 degree, 1.5 degrees Celsius. Let me point out this one. If you have slightly less than 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you have ice. If you have slightly above 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you have water. So this is the tipping point. And this tipping point is happening as the Earth warms and that tipping point moves north or south. You're seeing more and more melting of the Arctic and of the glaciers and Greenland, etc. So that very minute increase in temperature makes a huge difference. So is the problem real? Yes. Must we change? Absolutely. So let's get into this. Can we change? And yes, we have the solutions in hand. The solutions are called clean, renewable energy. That's not the total answer, okay? And I'll talk to you about that in a minute, but it is a huge step in the right direction. Globally, wind capacity has increased, as you can see, in the last 10 years, has gone up dramatically in terms of megawatts. Now, don't be fooled by this slide. I will admit that this, you know, is not a huge percentage of our energy needs, but it is, this solution is moving in the right direction. And why has that been able to happen? Because the cost has been coming down. All of this has to relate to, you know, cost. And you can see that in the last 20 years or so, the cost of creating windmills has decreased substantially. Globally, wind could supply all of the energy consumptions we require 40 times over. So there is a limitless amount of wind available. Solar, same thing. Solar voltaic installations, photovoltaic installations have gone up astronomically in the last 10 years. The reason why that's been able to happen, look at the cost of the solar cell modules, you know, starting from $80 a watt, and now it's down to 25 cents a watt. So huge decrease in costs. And of course, that's why this technology is working. So you say, well, why don't we see more of it? I mean, you know, obviously it's cheaper, right? Well, let's take a look at global energy subsidies real quick. Renewables were subsidized to the tune of about 143 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. Fossil fuels, 5.3 trillion, or like 37 times the amount of subsidies that we see going into renewables. This was in 2017. So here's the big problem. And if you have an opportunity to vote and to eliminate or reduce these subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, please, please, please do so. So let's say we took those subsidies away, and let's look at the cost of energy in the US. Nuclear, you see, is by far the most costly per megawatt hour at 150. Conventional coal is at 100, which is a lot better. Gas is at 60, okay, roughly. So the reason why you see natural gas replacing coal is because it's cheaper, okay? And we'll see that in a minute. But look at renewable energy. It's down around 40. Renewable energy, when you take away all those subsidies, is cheaper by far than any other form of energy. There's enough solar energy that reaches the Earth every hour to supply our energy needs for a year. So there's even more of a prodigious amount of energy available from the sun. So the question always comes up, what happens if the sun don't shine and the wind don't blow? And the answer is, you know, we need to take a look at energy I'm going to just start that slide so you can see what we did over the last 5 years, gone up, but look at what's going to happen in the next 20 years. And you say, okay, you know, if this plays out, there will be plenty of storage that'll be available to us. So at night or whenever the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, we'll still have an uninterrupted source. How is that happening? How is that going to happen? Well, look at the price of batteries, same kind of scenario. In the last 8 years, it's dropped over 80% in cost. So I fully expect that those costs are going to continue to drop, and the cost of creating battery packs is going to continue to get cheaper, and you'll see that increase in battery storage happen. The other reason why it's going to happen is because if you look at new capacity forecast, investments in fossil fuel versus clean energy, you'll see that this year alone, there will be twice as much money invested in renewables as in fossil fuels. By 2025, that number comes to about 3 times or 4 times as much. And by 2030, you know, we're looking at 5 times or more amount of investment. So you can see where the investment money is going. It's going into clean energy, and fossil fuel is getting lower and lower. Nuclear is not really an issue or an answer. Auto manufacturers. Every auto manufacturer now has an electric model in production. And one of the important factors here when you start looking at the cost, so this is a chart that shows the efficient fuel-powered cars, the cost of their powertrain going up over time, and here's the cost of mainstream electric cars. And you notice that in about 3 years, or roughly 3 years, the cost of electric cars is going to dip below the cost of fossil fuel cars. When that happens, that's going to be a paradigm shift, okay? And people are suddenly going to find out, wow, it's cheaper to buy an electric car than it is a fossil fuel car. My last slide and my favorite slide is this entire presentation. This is the Kentucky Coal Mining Museum in Benham, Kentucky. And a few years ago, they installed solar panels on their roofs. And these solar panels, not only, you know, they estimate it'll save the museum $8,000 to $10,000 a year in energy costs. The solar panels are also powering half the town of Benham, Kentucky, by the way. But I just think it's absolutely ironic that here's the Coal Mining Museum installing solar panels on their roof. So the question is, can we change? Hey, if those guys can do it, yes, we can. It's out there and ready to roll. So let's move on to will we? Okay, and this is the dicey one. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement, basically every nation in the world, including the US, signed on to achieve net zero greenhouse emissions by the mid-century. Fortunately, the US cannot, even though the administration says they cannot legally withdraw until the day after the 2020 presidential election. So I'm not telling you how to, you know, who to vote for. I'm just saying vote for somebody who's not going to take us out of the Paris Accords, please. People always say, well, what about China and India? They pollute more than we do. Yeah, they do on a total emissions basis, but not on a per capita basis. We pollute way more on a per capita basis. But more importantly, both India and China are on track to overachieve their Paris commitments. And you say, well, how so? Prove it to me. Well, if you look at the new electricity capacity in China in 2018, 53% of it came from solar and wind. So that's a huge increase from where they were, and it's reducing their dependence on coal significantly. So you can see that that China is definitely moving in the right direction. Here's my second favorite slide. This is a solar farm in China, and obviously you can only see this from the air, but you have to love, you know, the people have a sense of humor here, but they call this the solar panda. Anyway, let's talk about India. So 2018. India, 65% of their new capacity is from solar and wind. Again, they're cutting into that huge dependence on coal. And so we see India also moving in the right direction in terms of where their energy is coming from. Europe is, of course, way ahead of we talked about that earlier in this discussion, but 88% of their new capacity is coming from solar and wind. And you see coal is almost gone, which is nice. And very little natural gas to boot. Now you say, well, what about the US? Well, we're coming along, okay? 49% in 2018 was from solar and wind, new capacity. And that's the good news. The rest is all natural gas, which makes sense because, and you notice coal is almost non-existent, okay? They are not building new coal plants, thank God, okay? But we are making inroads against, you know, natural gas is better than coal, but it also burns dirty, right? It also puts CO2 up into the atmosphere. So we really need to take a cold look at that. You can see coal consumption since 2010 is dropping like a rock, and I think that by the end of this decade, you'll see that gone, hopefully. In fact, in 2020, this year, we're expected to retire another 13 gigawatts of coal-fired plants. And in its place, we're going to be installing an additional 186 gigawatts of solar and wind. So you can see that the new energy is moving in the direction of clean, renewable energy. Jobs, people talk about, loss of jobs. The two fastest growing occupations in this country are solar panel installers and wind turbine technicians. And this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, okay? And they're telling us, hey, this is where the jobs are. 190 companies have said they're going to go to 100% renewable. When you look at all these names like, Google and Walmart and others, and you think, wow, okay, that's going to make a huge difference as well. If the country were to pull out of the Paris Accords, 20 states representing 49% of the people have formed what's called the United States Climate Alliance. And these states, led by California, New York, and Washington, are saying, if the US pulls out, we're staying in. We are going to meet the dictates of the Paris Accords if they don't. In fact, in September of 2018, when Jerry Rice was Jerry Rice, football player. How about Jerry Brown? When Jerry Brown was leaving office, they passed legislation. He signed legislation that by 2045, 100% of the state electricity will be carbon free. Now, y'all understand, California if it was a standalone, being the world's 5th largest economy, that's huge, okay? That's a huge impact on the planet. How about big money? When big money talks, people tend to listen. BlackRock, which has its issues, but it's a $6 trillion asset manager, has just issued in the last year a climate risk warning to their investors. And they're basically saying, hey, the markets are not assigning the proper level of risk to climate change as they should. Therefore, your investments could be overstated, right? Their value. The important part of this is that they are recognizing the reality of climate change when a lot of other folks are not. How about the Federal Reserve? So the Federal Reserve in the last month has issued a report saying, that there is going to be a definite impact on long-term monetary policy. Lael Brainerd, she's one of the federal governors, is saying, hey, they're already looking at the impact of climate change on the risk of long-term monetary policy. And it's a major factor in deciding whether to raise or lower long-term interest rates. Again, another admission by now the Federal Reserve that climate change is real and that it's having an impact and that we need to consider that in our long-term economic growth. Okay, enough of what everybody else is doing. What about you? So some of the things that people can do, not everybody can do, but in the last year, actually last November, in fact, I installed solar panels on my roof. I'm putting my money where my mouth is, have to. And right now on this nice sunny day, I'm generating a ton of electricity and I love it. Okay, I'm ahead of the game. I also bought my electric car in August of last year. I have to sheepishly admit it's a Tesla. My wife thinks I bought a new toy, and I have. It's great. It's the best car I've ever owned, but it is all electric, and I'm basically powering that with my solar panels. Now, not everybody can do that, but what everybody can do is this one. Okay, opt up to 100% renewable energy. So if you look at all the counties in the Bay Area, every one of them has their own community choice energy program. In San Jose, it's called San Jose Clean Energy. And if you live around the San Jose area, it's Silicon Valley Clean Energy. Now, what you can do is you can email those folks, and it's just the first letter. So Silicon Valley Clean Energy would be svce.org, and say, hey, I want to opt up to 100%. So you notice that right now, Silicon Valley Clean Energy is providing you with about 50% clean energy, which is up from the 33% that PG&E used to provide. Okay, so these organizations actually buy the energy, supply it to PG&E, and they still deliver it to you. Okay, so we're still using PG&E's lines, but we're buying clean energy. If you want, you can opt up to 100% in their Green Prime program, and they will buy the requisite amount of clean energy to provide you with 100% clean energy. And you can do that right now. And the cost, you look down below, it's about $3.60 a month of increased cost. Hey, come on, that's like a latte a month. I think we could all afford that. Also know that that 100% green, that number is going to come down over time. We've just been talking about that, right? So you know that number is going to decrease. So there's no excuse not to go right now online, contact Silicon Valley Clean Energy or San Jose Clean Energy and say, hey, I want to opt up. I've been doing, by the way, I've been doing this for a year, and my experience is less than $2 a month, less than $2 a month. So not even the amount they're talking about here. What else can you do? Voting pro climate. Absolutely. You have to get out and vote. If you don't do anything else, vote pro climate in the coming elections. Becoming a climate activist, you know, now some of us older folks like myself have been activists for a long time in different eras, but it's time to get back involved again. And so in joining demonstrations, engaging in conversations. I mean, another thing you can do is electrify your house. I mean, when it's time to replace appliances, go electric for sure. Because gas is not the best solution to the problem. And then joining organizations, 350.org, Climate Reality, which is the one I joined, Citizens Climate Lobby for the younger folks, Sunrise. These are all very activist organizations that, and it's nice because it gives you, you know, a group that you can, you know, go along with, and they give you information and things that you can do. Other things you can do, writing letters to editors is very effective. You know, pick a topic, and if you see an article that appeals to you or doesn't appeal to you, write a letter talking about that article. The papers love that kind of stuff because they like people who read their articles. But calling, emailing, texting your representatives in the state and federal is also another great way to do it. I've been doing a lot of that lately, probably once or twice a week. And the nice thing is I get letters back. You know, obviously from their staffers, but saying, hey, we got your message, and here's what Zoe Lofgren or here's what whomever our representative is doing in this area. So it's really a great place to make your voices heard. Remember, they count these statistics. And so the more of us that do this, you become a multiplier effect, right? Talking about your places of worship, and I think you all have a great opportunity here. I'm going to talk about more about that in a minute. Reaching out to friends and relatives is another way. Just get in the conversation. I put out a weekly newsletter now. I started about a year ago, and that's my email address down there if you want to get on my list. And it's my list, by the way. It goes absolutely nowhere else. And I basically update everybody I know on what's going on. What's the latest, you know, in terms of this past week in the area of the climate crisis. So that's one other thing I do, and anyone can do. I did mention to Gerald that I did read Laudato Si, by the way, and I loved it. I had never seen it before. I'd never read it before. I loved the tagline on care for our common home. And some of the things that the Pope talks about in that, I just found, and this was written 5 years ago, which is interesting, but you know, he's spot on in terms of his view of what we're doing to the planet, and in particular, so he, you know, very specifically points out replacing fossil fuels with clean energy. He talks about generational equity, that we can't use up all the resources and leave nothing for the future generations. That's been a gift that we were given as humans, and we need to share that gift with the future. The tragedy of the commons is another thing he talks about a lot. He doesn't call it that, but basically what this is all of the common ground that, you know, is open and available to anyone is being seized and manipulated by individuals and companies and using it for their own personal gain to the detriment of the rest of the people. And so that's what they call the tragedy. And the Pope talks about that a lot, that national interests and corporate issues are being put above the interests of the common people. Poor developing countries being hit the hardest, talks about that a lot. Loss of biodiversity, which I've been talking about in this talk. One of the things he starts out the encyclical with, which I thought was pretty outstanding, he says, a crime against the natural world is not only a sin against humanity, but it is a sin against God. And the more I thought about that and took that in, I thought, wow, you know, that is really amazing. You know, we commit all our little minor sins, but these are major sins, major transgressions against God's creation. And I'm like, whoa, I really see where he's coming from. The last item I talk about is the circular model of production. And he talks about, basic the problems with our technocratic society, and that we are not, that we're totally embroiled in that. And without, if you think about a circular model of production, most of it is cradle to grave. You use something, you create it, you use it, and it goes in a landfill. He's talking about cradle to cradle, where you start with create something, you use it, you break it down to its components, and it becomes raw material, and you use it again. So circular economy is, again, one of the solutions. So that's not everything, but those are just the things that kind of stood out to me. And if we did this, if we followed that, what might the world look like? And this is my last slide, by the way. How about less smoggy days? How about fewer devastating forest fires? How about milder weather events or reduced immigration? How about more abundant, healthier food or improved health, improved visibility, improved biodiversity, a safe and healthy future for our children, our grandchildren, and all future life? So use your voice, use your vote, use your choices to speak truth to power, because like your world depends on it, because your world depends on it. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you found this finally this presentation useful and helpful, and I'll be happy to go into answering. Aaron and I will participate in answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you. It's great. I'll start with the first question. The Green New Deal is been part of the political dialogue. Can you comment on the Green New Deal and what it's all about? We hear that term, Green New Deal. And
okay.
Also, what is the future of that program as a possibility?
Well, I would just start by saying that the Green New Deal is not a law, it's a direction. It was just like, when Franklin Roosevelt created the New Deal, it's a direction that says that anything we do in the future is going to be, you have to take into consideration the environmental impact, and, in the area of climate change, even more so. And it's a direction, and it's any laws that we develop over time, should follow that direction. Aaron, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, the Green New Deal has several specific tenets as well. Some of its premises are abandoning or stopping any further investments on fossil fuel-based infrastructure. So it would no longer support things like the building of new coal plants or the building of new natural gas plants. And resources would be turned towards further cultivating renewable resources. And it also has some more, there's sort of, I would say, controversial tenets, things like cheaper, more affordable university and college so that people have the skills to enter into the green economy. And it also pushes universal health care, because the premise for the Green New Deal is also that environmental equity is social equity. And so people who are poor or less able to adapt to climate change and whatnot are also the ones most likely to be impacted by it. And so, but we'll reach out to people most likely to be impacted to sort of defray the cost of that. It promotes things like reaching back to indigenous knowledge and local people and how to revitalize the existing areas that they live in. So it's things like reforestation and the reclamation of sort of degraded areas. So it's a whole sort of new paradigm that goes sort of counter to our current paradigm of endless consumption. So there's something called the New Consensus. There's quite a few think tanks that work on it, and it's a paradigm that they're hoping to put into policy, or to at least to guide policy, as it were.
But if you compare that to Laudato Si, it's very similar, because it gives, the Pope's encyclical gives us exactly the same direction in terms of what we need to do about the current society and the lifestyle changes we have to make. Everything that Aaron is really talking about there is really part and parcel of what that encyclical is telling us as well.
Yeah, and it equates environmental justice and social justice. They're very much intertwined.
Recently, the Pope had a synod in Brazil, which is one of the other very sensitive areas on the planet because of the Amazon and its ability to capture carbon. So he came out with a document which seems to be kind of like an update of Laudato Si, emphasizing the role of indigenous people, what they can teach us about Mother Earth, and being able to learn from that experience they've had. In my previous part of my life, I was in Bolivia for a while, and I know in Bolivia, for example, and they have tribal groups that actually are being paid to protect the forests. Instead of cutting down the forest, we want to save the forest. Do you want to comment on that? On reforestation, you might say, or protecting our forests.
Bill, can I take that one?
Sure, please.
That's actually a big push as well. Pakistan, as part of their sort of attempt to get their economy started again after COVID, has also hired 10,000 unemployed workers to plant trees. I know Ethiopia has done the same thing. And in South America, they've taken former poachers and have turned the poachers into park rangers to protect the animals that they used to hunt. And so that's actually something that Brazil is doing, although Brazil sort of struggles a little bit with dealing with its indigenous populations in a fair way. And it's a lot about sort of making the commons common again. And so instead of being open to exploitation, it's an opportunity for people to thrive jointly and in community with it. And so that's actually part of the Green New Deal. It's like you're saying, people who live in the environment know how to care for it. People who rely on the environment are more inclined to be invested in its welfare. So just like the rangers must take care of the rhinos because that's their job and that's what they get benefit out of, it's the same with the indigenous people. Since it's their home and it's their responsibility. So it's sort of like community empowerment as opposed to sort of the current thing we have right now where it's either it belongs to somebody and we exclude people from it, or it's supposed to belong to everybody but nobody's responsible. So that's definitely one way that they're hoping to go forward.
We've had a project for about 8 years in Kenya, Global Ministries, of working with teachers, and now we've included an environmental component because the country there is trying to reforest, doing reforestation. So the schools, they're teaching the children to plant trees, and that's part. Every school is supposed to plant a certain number of trees. And so the work we've been doing there has been partly interfaith because some of the conflicts are between different cultural and religious groups. But then now we've incorporated environmental education as part of the program that we do since 2012. Unfortunately, with the coronavirus, we're kind of limited. We're still trying to do it, but remotely. Because usually we go there each summer and work with a group of about 20 to 25 principals. We started with teachers, now we've been working with principals. So education, just to add this component, maybe you can comment on it. How do we bring this down to the level of the future generations in terms of education? Because I think environmental education and connecting with the spirituality of the earth and making it part of the curriculum, because unfortunately our Western style of education is lacking in spirituality, that the earth is our mother, and we need to connect with the earth in a new way. Since the time of Francis Bacon, we've had an educational system that exploits the earth. It doesn't see the connection we have as human beings with the earth. I don't know if you could comment on the role of education. See it, because I think that's the key for if enough young, like Greta Thunberg, for example, you didn't mention her, but she's been such a light for us in this time. Well, mobilizing the young people.
I'll just make one quick comment, Aaron, and I'll let you go on it. I have a slide that I took out just in the interest of time, but it shows a picture of a grass hut in southern Sudan. And on that grass hut is solar panel, all right? The cost of solar panels has come down so much that these folks can actually afford that. And what that does is it connects them to the outer world via the internet. And so when you talk about the opportunity for education, there's an example of where the lowering cost of solar can actually really put these young folks in touch with a much better opportunity for education. Erin?
And I think going from the point that you were making previously about how you're taking the principals and the teachers out and you're having them plant trees and have that ownership of it, there's a big disconnect in Western society between nature and the people who live in cities and whatnot. The understanding of the relationship between nature and our modern lifestyle is missing in a lot of ways. And so I do know that a lot of communities are doing things like even community gardens. Children don't know where tomatoes come from, things like that. And then when they realize that it's too hot and the tomatoes die or whatnot, they get a better understanding of the direct impact of climate change on their world. There also has been a big push in linking education, environment, and women, particularly with things like reforestation. I know you may be familiar with the work of Wangari Maathai since you work in Africa, but she was a huge advocate of replanting and greening sort of the areas along the Sahara and part of her country to sort of improve both the environment, the air, and also to help the women, because the women were having to walk miles and miles to get firewood and to get resources from the forest because it had been deforested so much. And so there's been a lot of push linking forestry and care of local lands with women's empowerment. So I think education is coming, but we do not have an integrated aspect of environmental education in a lot of Western societies, particularly on a spiritual level, like saying that there's a belief of man's dominion over the earth, and we've sort of interpreted dominion as a right of exploitation as opposed to more stewardship.
No.
We're hoping that paradigm is changing a little bit.
One of the leaders in this field at Santa Clara University is Professor Teresia Hinga. She's from Kenya. She has been working with us. She's part of our group that does this educational work in Kenya. But she has been, she teaches the religious studies, but she also does a lot in the environmental education. So she's been able to develop a whole curriculum around this for Santa Clara University students. And she's also been one of our keynote speakers in our project in Kenya. She goes to Kenya each summer and does work there in the environmental field.
What was her name again?
Dr. Teresia Hinga, H-I-N-G-A. She's a member of the religious studies faculty of Santa Clara University, and she's one of our consultants for our work in our project in Kenya.
And a lot of the new environmental movements, there's three types of environmental movements. You know, there's like the post-industrial, and then there's post-colonial, and then there's post-material. And a lot of the post-colonial ones that you see in developing nations are based on faith. And a lot of both reclaiming their national identity as well as their own, the spirituality of the people they're in with it.
Yeah.
And those can be more powerful. She's
part of a women's theology forum of leading theologians, women theologians in East and Southern Africa. And so they have been very active in promoting a lot of these themes in the, because, you know, Southern Africa or East Africa, at least where we go, is a very religious area of the world. It's not secularized like, you know, we are in the United States or Europe. So religion is very much part of the culture. And so we've been trying to work with those themes and as we work with the people there. And we're very pleased that the government now is recognizing the work we're doing, Ministry of Education, that you have to create this ecological holistic curriculum if you're going to succeed in overcoming a lot of the problems they have. And which one of it is corruption. You know, ethics and morality have to be connected up with this ecological theme, because unfortunately, because of colonialism, a lot of the people still are trying to grab their little piece of material wealth, and it's ruining their country. So they're trying to overcome that by teaching the children that they're all in this together. We have to have an ethical component to what how we're educating. And I think we need the same thing in the United States. So one question I have is, how can we get is the coronavirus changing the whole situation of our understanding? Maybe this is like a blessing in disguise.
Well, actually, I took a bunch of slides that I had in there out for the essence of time, but absolutely. But the coronavirus does, and there's a very close parallelism between the two, is that happens very quickly. And so we get excited about it because we see people dying. It's peaking. It happens in a period of weeks or months. And so it's easy to get on the bandwagon and do whatever it is we need to do to deal with the coronavirus. On the other side, climate change is just as insidious, will kill many more people down the time track. And yet, because it's happening so slowly, people are not getting excited over the consequences of it. And we need to start taking action today to deal with the problem. So there's a very close relationship between the two.
I also think it has provided an opportunity for people to reevaluate. Quarantine has had the effect of people realizing that, they didn't have to take that flight, or they don't actually have to do the commute.
Right.
And a lot of the argument against acting on climate change was people said the sacrifices would be too hard. It's not possible. We cannot change as a society. And we have, in a sense, proven ourselves wrong, because we absolutely have changed our society, and we were able to do so in a matter of weeks. And so a lot of the painful things that we claimed we couldn't endure, we have been. And so I think that has removed a very pesky argument against acting against climate change. And I'm hoping that it's part of a larger paradigm shift where the value of certain things is emphasized. And it has done a very good job of highlighting weaknesses in our current system, and has led, I think, many people to sort of reflect on, an economy that is so strong that people can't afford to miss a paycheck is maybe not an economic system that works for everybody. Or maybe there are more social safety nets that need to be put in place. And a lot of that can also be tied to changes in environment. And it's also lucky because another argument against addressing climate change is it's too expensive. But we have trillions of dollars in stimulus money that could very easily be targeted towards building up fossil-free infrastructures, supporting renewable energies. And that would do the effect of getting people back to work, retraining them, stimulating the economy, and addressing the climate change. That's actually what Europe did. They have a $5 trillion package that they've gone through as an economic stimulus. And it is based on what they call the Green Deal, which means it is all going to be pushed towards addressing and mitigating the impacts of climate change. And so the argument we had that taking care of the environment and economic success were mutually exclusive has fallen apart. And there's sort of a realization now that we can both have economic, vitality for everybody, and it can be tied to protection of the environment.
Marianne, did you have any comments?
I have a question, but I also just want to start by saying this is a phenomenal presentation. It's so professional. It's so beautifully done. It's engaging. I don't have any background in engineering and minimal in the natural sciences, and I could follow it. So just thank you for that, and thanks both to Bill and Aaron for their very helpful commentary. Something that Bill said in the midst of the presentation caught my attention. For a long time, the scientific community, and I'm thinking here the Union of Concerned Scientists, they were promoting nuclear energy. Mm-hmm. And I remember being distraught at that because I was a member of UCS, and because I had just read an article in the journal Science about spent fuel rods, and that we haven't figured out a way to sustainably deal with them. So, and then you said nuclear energy is no longer considered a renewable energy source. And so has the scientific community basically finally left behind the whole, trust they were placing in nuclear energy as a sustainable alternative?
I think right now the nuclear is basically considered a backup system because all of the money, as you saw in my slides, is going towards renewables, investment in renewables. You saw a very small amount nuclear, and that's not to build new nuclear plants. It's just to maintain and keep the current ones going. And I would support that. I think trying to shut down a nuclear plant would be a mini disaster all in itself because of all of the pollution issues that would be
You know,
involved.
Bill, they're doing it in the Hudson Valley. Governor Cuomo
Yeah.
has taken steps, and that there is a planned shutdown of
Okay.
Indian Point nuclear plant. To the relief of many of us, even though I no longer live in the Hudson Valley, but it's such a populated area. If there
Oh,
were
yeah.
to be an
Yeah.
accident. So yeah, and there is worry that there will be, you know, a lack of power, lack of energy, lack of electricity for people, but it's still being done.
Right, and like I say, you know, yeah, there's always the possibility of a Fukushima, problem, and so to the extent that we can really move away from those is where we want to go. Like I say, the only purpose they can serve right now, as far as I'm concerned, is just a backup system, just in case any areas along the grid go down. But there's no reason to build anything new, and there's no reason to to keep them going once we have appropriate backup systems in place. So I totally agree with you, and I think I think everybody is in agreement about the concern, and it's always been the concern about what do you do with the spent nuclear fuel. I mean, there's nothing to do with it. You can't store it. You can't, right now they haven't figured out a way to reuse it either. So yeah.
I think they were storing it in a mountain in Shoshone territory, and there we get back to environmental justice.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's most often stored someplace where the people did not get the benefit of the nuclear energy, and they're just having to deal with the nuclear fuel rods. I do know that Americans are much more cautious of nuclear energy than some other countries, because, for instance, France and Switzerland both get about 20% of their energy from nuclear power. And that is just sort of an accepted aspect of their sort of energy architecture. And I don't know if they're actively building nuclear power plants, but they're not planning on shutting those down. So the tolerance for nuclear energy does change country by country. And so I wouldn't say there's a scientific consensus as to whether or not they're safe, but there's sort of a population tolerance depending on where you are.
I was going to mention that you mentioned the Union of Concerned Scientists, and my wife and I attended the Parliament of World Religions in Toronto last November, and that kind of brought together the scientific community and the interfaith community and the indigenous community from around the world. They brought indigenous leaders from many parts of the world. I happened to sit with one of the leaders from the Amazon for one of the programs that was done by the Union of Concerned Scientists. So this was an interesting meeting that brought together largely around climate issues, the spiritual communities of the world, and in dialogue with the scientists. So then, of course, we had the coronavirus following. So all these things are kind of overlapping and interacting now. Maybe we're into a new paradigm. Hans Kung, who was one of the founders of the global ethic when the Parliament was initiated in 1994, spoke about the need for a global ethic. And that's kind of where I think we're at right now. We have these small pockets of people who are pushing for these programs, but we need to create a consensus across the world for a new global ethic where the buy-in occurs at the political, the cultural, the educational, the scientific, and religious community level. And I think that may be what our mission is for all of us. If this is to be, if we're going to go into this new paradigm, this new era that we all need for the planet, for the earth, and for our future generations. So yeah, so we hope to spread the word far and wide. And thank you so much for preparing. The presentation was fabulous. Now, what plans do you have to try to, are you working with different groups now where you can spread this message? Would you have any groups that you would like us to reach out to that you think we could work with in addition to ones I mentioned already?
Yeah, in fact, Aaron and I are both co-leaders of the Speakers Bureau here in Santa Clara County. So we are definitely looking for more opportunities to spread the word. We've talked to groups like Rotary Club, and we've talked to a number of churches. we would love to get more, into those areas, because people seem to have the right sort of mindset and attitude and value system that we need to get this message across to. So, yeah. By the way, you do have permission for us to use, this however you like. We've edited the slides so that everything is allowable to be streamed. There's nothing that would affect anybody's
Great.
rights. So please, by all means.
Yeah, I'm sure Marita will be interested in, since she's the chair of the Care for Our Common Home, the Stewards of Our Common Home for the Diocese of San Jose. And she's also doing the Laudato Si course for GMU starting in June. So,